This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Venezuela's post-election crisis has no clear end in sight, as Nicolás Maduro doubles down on fraud and repression. On today's podcast, we'll look at potential paths forward, including efforts by Brazil and Colombia to find some kind of negotiated solution.
Part of the reason that they're willing to take this role is that the Venezuelan crisis, and this is different from Nicaragua, for example, that you were mentioning before, it's a crisis that it's not only about Venezuela, it's about the region.
A couple of years ago, a former New York Times correspondent in Caracas, William Newman, published a book about Venezuela's long crisis. The title was, "Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse." Unfortunately, that adage has been proven true once again in the aftermath of Venezuela's July 28 elections. Since then, Nicolás Maduro has resorted to fraud to claim victory in the vote and unleashed a wave of repression worse than any seen in Venezuela before. More than 2,000 arrests just in the last 2 weeks by the government's own count. Ordinary people are being stopped on the street by police who check their cell phones for any sign of opposition support. Many fear that opposition leader Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, who was by all credible accounts the real winner of the July 28 vote, could be arrested at any time. Everybody has the same question. What now? Will Venezuela continue down this path to total repression of all dissent, similar to what Nicaragua has endured in recent years? Or is there some chance of a negotiated solution that might eventually lead to a democratic transition? I am skeptical of the more hopeful scenario, and I have expressed that in the pages of America's Quarterly and elsewhere. But our guest today is more optimistic. It's not a blind optimism. He has several interesting points. He points to some signs of division within the Venezuelan state apparatus, and also has an insider's view of the efforts at negotiation currently being undertaken by Colombia and Brazil. Roberto Patiño is our guest. He is the founder of two NGOs in Venezuela, Mi Convive and Alimenta la Solidaridad, that work with food security and violence in poor areas of Caracas. He is a member of the Venezuelan opposition who has been active in some of these international efforts to find a transition to democracy. Roberto speaks to us from New York, where he now lives. Roberto, welcome to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here.
Roberto, I spoke a bit in the introduction about the scale of repression that's happening on the ground in Venezuela right now. My question for you is, what do you see as the opposition strategy right now for dealing with this and ultimately trying to get to a democratic transition? What I see is a somewhat more patient approach than in previous crises, even though in some ways the circumstances are much worse.
Sure. So as you say, repression has been really terrible on the ground, and it's really personal for all of us. I have friends who are in custody that we haven't heard from for over 2 weeks, colleagues, community leaders that I respect, that I admire for their grassroots work, who have been detained and whose human rights have been violated. Also, of course, there's broad threats to anyone who has had any role in fighting the regime. And I think it's very important to give visibility and to denounce what's happening in Venezuela has no precedent in the country. And the scale and the brutality of the repression has been really horrible. So in terms of strategy, I think it's very important to put into perspective what's happened on July 28. The opposition was united in a strategy of participating in a very unfair process. And in that context, in the context of such a uneven playing field, there was a massive landslide victory for the opposition. And I think this deserves to be front and center with respect to strategy, because it shows that the Venezuelan people is united in wanting change, right? And in a lot of authoritarian contexts, the problem is that you don't have an opposition that it's organized, that it's mobilized, that it's willing to take risks. And I think the Venezuelan opposition has proved once again, after, of course, many missteps and mistakes, that the Venezuelan desire for change is very much alive.
So that's all true and important to know. But at the same time, and you reference kind of the learning from previous chapters of this long, decade plus long crisis Venezuela's been going through, we have not seen from Maria Corina an effort, for example, to have other countries immediately recognize Edmundo Gonzalez as the president-elect, which is something that the U.S. government under the Biden administration has not done. We also see her, in my view, not trying to force kind of the ultimate confrontation on this right away. Do you agree with my interpretation of what's going on? And if so, why is she and the opposition more broadly taking this more patient tack?
I think the opposition has a winning hand. What I mean is that we know this is a brutal regime that has the support of the top military brass and, of course, of the intelligence apparatus. And if the opposition overexposes the people to demonstrations, we know what's going to come. I think the opposition is playing smart the cards that it has. The regime in July 28 lost any credible story that would legitimize their position as rulers of Venezuela. They lost really badly. And I think the opposition is pushing the argument that has also limited the international alliances that the regime has in terms of the solidarity that they would expect from the Latin American left. What I hear from community leaders, from the opposition in general, is that what happened, and I can say for myself as well, it's something that we, of course, hoped that the regime was going to respect the results, but it's not surprising for us that they decided to just make up crazy numbers. So, and I think in general, the population understands that we're fighting a brutal regime that it's willing to do everything to stay in power. And in a way, I think there's still the trust in Edmundo and Maria Corina allows for them to design a strategy that might have elements of patience, as you were saying, but also needs, of course, to have concrete actions.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be clear. Maria Corina and Edmundo Gonzalez are stating very clearly that they won the election. They're calling on a democratic transition. So it's not like they're biting their tongues. Far from it. But let me see if I can ask you to define a little bit where you feel like this is headed. We have the next step in this seems to be a court that is very obviously aligned with Maduro, will likely rule in the next couple of weeks and declare that the election was legitimate. No big surprise there. Nobody serious in the global community expects that to go in another direction. Is the bet then essentially like a medium to long-term bet on peaceful protest, international pressure, trying to show to the world that this election was not, that the result was not respected? Is there anything else recent in world history that you feel like this is comparable to?
I think after July 28th, we entered a new phase, right? Before July 28th, the regime was pretending to be a democracy and was trying, as I was saying, to push the opposition out of the elections and divide the opposition to claim through popular will, quote unquote, that they had a legitimate claim to rule Venezuela. After July 28th, that's no longer the case. And now we can analyze the Venezuelan regime from a clear-eye perspective as an authoritarian military junta, basically, right? And when you're thinking about a regime that has such characteristics, the most important element for change, I think, is to break the regime's cohesion. basically they need a story to tell themselves to stay cohesive. And that story was completely destroyed after July 28 because they all know it's a lie. They know that they lost the election as well. Second, they use fear within their own ranks. So they are spying on their own people and they're being very brutal against their own people. Our strategy should be focused on trying to limit the repressive capacity of the regime through a targeted approach against the people who are leading these efforts. And second, to make it very clear for the majority of people who are still within the ranks of the regime that the future does not entail retribution against them, that they should not fear the future. And for me, on July 28, also something very important happened with defections from the regime. And these defections were at the lower level because at 6 p.m. during the election, the regime sent an order saying to the military Plan República, who's stationed at each polling station, and to the CNE, the electoral officials, that they should not give to the opposition copies of the actas or of the electoral receipts. And by 8 p.m., the opposition had around 40% of the actas. But this order was disobeyed massively around the country. And we saw that the opposition was capable of reaching over 83% of actas. So you're already seeing that the regime has defections at the lower levels. And this is what we need to encourage. And we need to encourage it through international pressure, through, of course, peaceful demonstrations in Venezuela, and also by creating a framework and a narrative that the future will not generate costs for those who decide to participate in a transition.
So what I'm hearing, Roberto, and correct me if I'm wrong, is essentially a strategy that bets on fractures within the regime itself, not necessarily among Maduro and the network of generals and others who kind of sustain his power, but really throughout the state apparatus writ large. Do you see, beyond the signs that you've cited, is there anything else to point to specifically within the Venezuelan military, which we know is such an important power broker? Is there anything else out there?
From my perspective, it's not only about the military, but also about different political factions within the regime. And I'm going to use two examples. One example is the example of Tarek el-Aissami. Tarek el-Aissami used to be part of Maduro's inner circle. And as all of them, he was stealing a lot of money. And he had his own political project. Tarek el-Aissami was probably part of Maduro's WhatsApp group. Now they have probably a Telegram group now that they decided to abandon WhatsApp. But he was in the highest levels of decision-making within Chavismo. And Tarek el-Aissami is now in prison. And I'm sure that Diosdado Cabello and all the others who are in that same level see themselves as well in Tarek el-Aissami. They could be next. They could be also in prison. So I think that also signals that cohesion, even at the top level, is not as strong as they want us to perceive it. And the second example I wanted to use is the example of Arias Cárdenas, the ambassador to Mexico, who published a letter with a narrative on which he's basically saying that they won the election or whatever, but asking the CNE, why aren't you publishing the actas, And part of the legacy of Hugo Chavez, according to him, and he was part of the coup in 1992, that was the start of Chavez's political career, was saying part of the legacy of Chavez is having the best electoral system in the world. So why would you allow this system to be questioned? Just publish the actas. And it's evident that he knows as well that if they publish the actas, it will be clear for everyone to see that they lost by a massive landslide. So you're starting to see examples and signals of those tensions that from not only in the military, but also in the different political factions within the regime exist.
Our listeners will be aware that there is an effort by Brazil, Colombia, and to a lesser extent, Mexico, to at least engage in some kind of talks with the Maduro regime. Not mediation, I don't think we can call it that yet, but at least an effort to open the door. These are governments that have been sympathetic to Chavismo and to Maduro over the years, but they have so far declined to recognize Maduro's declared result. And they too are calling for the publication of the ballot by ballot count. Now, as we record this, there have been signs of divisions among this group and signs that point to the fragility of these possible negotiations. But the initiative hasn't fallen apart quite yet. Roberto, what is your evaluation as we record this of this joint effort by these countries? And how important is it to a potential democratic transition in the weeks and months ahead?
Part of the reason that they're willing to take this role is that the Venezuelan crisis, and this is different from Nicaragua, for example, that you were mentioning before, it's a crisis that it's not only about Venezuela, it's about the region. Boric from Chile has been very forceful, and I admire everything he's been saying, because it's a matter, first, of the principles, of respecting the will of the people, which is important for the region, because you could also have authoritarians, people with authoritarian mindsets all over Latin America saying, well, if Maduro can pull that off in Venezuela, why wouldn't I be capable of pulling that off here? Right? So it's a danger for the region to allow this to happen in a country such as Venezuela. And second, Venezuela is no longer, for Latin American countries in general, only a foreign policy problem. It's also a domestic problem, right? Because you have hundreds of thousands of migrants who have come to countries who have not recovered economically since the pandemic, that have weak states, that don't have the capacity to provide social services to the people. And what you're seeing is that this is generating a lot of social tension in these countries. So they want to see a solution, because they know that if there's no solution in Venezuela, the migrant crisis will only get worse.
I'm sure you've heard the view, though, that these are leftist governments. They're just pretending to be at the negotiating table. They're actually sympathizers with Maduro. And I've heard that view a lot, including from members of the Venezuelan diaspora. I know you've heard it too. What's your response?
For the Latin American left, Maduro is a big problem. He's damaging their brand. What is the left in Latin America about? Are they about progressive values? And are they about democracy? Or the Latin American left is about just a coalition of power-hungry people that are willing to accept anything in the name of values that they don't follow? So I think that's why Boric has been such an important voice, because he's making it clear there are things that are not acceptable anywhere. It doesn't matter if you call yourself left or right. It's a matter of human rights. It's a matter of democracy. It's a matter of the rule of law. So I do understand the skepticism. I also have it, by the way, because we cannot forget that recently Lula was saying that the migrant crisis was a narrative or something like that, he said, which was really bad, I think.
It was actually, in my view, worse than that. What he said was that the whole story about Venezuelan democracy being under attack was just a narrative. And he said that at his presidential palace after receiving Maduro for what amounted to a state visit. And that was a little more than a year ago. And I mention this here not only because it was important, but because it shows you the degree to which Lula seems to have changed his views on Maduro since then.
Yeah. And I think, Brian, the big problem for the people within the Lula administration that might just want to pretend, that might just want to help Maduro or whatever, is that this has become also a political problem within Brazil, within Colombia, within Mexico to a lesser extent. But I was following that there was a debate between the candidates for mayor to Sao Paulo. And the candidate Boulos, I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly, he's from PSOL and PT, got attacked 4 times during the debate for being a Maduro supporter. He said it was fake news. He just laughed it away. But you're starting to see that it's not only the media in Brazil that pays a lot of attention to what's going on in Venezuela, but it's also the political class. And I think this is going to put a lot of pressure on Lula and on the PT in general, not to pretend that they're trying to find a solution, but to actually work for it.
And what we've seen right now, what's unfolding in Venezuela as we speak, I think will very clearly have an impact on presidential elections in Chile next year, in Brazil and Colombia in 2026 for these very reasons. Let me ask you, though, Roberto, about the other side of the equation here. Why would Maduro care at the end of the day if Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico never recognize his government? Because my assumption, and I've written this for AQ and said it in a couple of other spots, my assumption is that this is a regime that does not fear only losing power. What they fear is facing jail, and specifically like a U.S. federal prison for their crimes, which include corruption, human rights abuses, drug trafficking, according to the U.S. Department of Justice indictment that was handed down 4 years ago. And so at the end of the day, they just want to hold on to power. They don't care what the Lulas and the Petros and the AMLOs really have to say. What's your read on it?
I agree that they don't care about what they have to say, but they do care about something. When you think about a negotiation strategy, you need to think, and strategy in general, people have to assess the so-called BATNA, right? The better alternative to a negotiated agreement. So what is the alternative to Maduro, to a negotiation? Maduro has been saying very clearly that if the governments, specifically the US, but the West in general, don't recognize him, he doesn't care, because he will just come closer to and become a pawn probably of BRICS. That's what he claims, right? And I think the fact that Maduro is becoming toxic for Lula specifically and for Brazil, it makes it less likely that Lula, who's the gatekeeper of BRICS in Latin America, will help him get the kind of support that he needs.
But Maduro does have the support of two very important countries that endorsed his quote-unquote victory from the day after, and that's China and Russia. Isn't that enough to survive?
So far it has been, but we have to also evaluate the kind of relationship these two countries have with Maduro. And for example, in the case of China, during Chavez's presidency, Venezuela received the biggest or the most amount of money in Latin America from the Chinese government in terms of loans, over $60 billion, if I don't recall incorrectly. Since Maduro, that hasn't happened, so they do support Maduro diplomatically. They come out and say Maduro won, congratulations, and they might accept a delegation of the Maduro regime to come to visit Beijing and go to the Great Wall. But in terms of concrete investments and support, what the Chinese have signaled so far is that they're not willing to go the extra mile for Maduro, at least not in these conditions. They have not been willing to violate US sanctions just to support Maduro. So, and in the case of Russia, it's different. Of course, Russia is more of a spoiler, I think, in the region, and they're trying to keep Maduro as a problem for the US in Latin America. And the support that they give, it's more, I would say, in terms of the military to military advice and support in general. But I think in terms of what really keeps the regime united, and it's the need of money, investments, and I don't think Russia will be a lifeline for Maduro. I don't see that.
It's funny, Roberto, we've talked about several countries. We haven't really spoken in much detail about the United States. And that's partly because, at least so far, the countries that we've mentioned, the trio of Latin American countries plus China and Russia, have seemed more important. That's a difference from past crises, particularly the period during which Juan Guaido was recognized, not just by Washington, but by a bunch of other countries in the region and in Europe as well. It seems to me like this time, at least so far, the U.S. has been content to let these Latin American countries, specifically Brazil, kind of take the lead in terms of trying to wedge the door open and start some kind of conversation about where things go from here. What's your evaluation of what the Biden administration is doing so far?
From my perspective, the Biden administration played an important role in helping the opposition when they negotiated with the regime back in October. And that, in a way, prevented the regime from being more violent against the primaries. So I think it was important. They play an important role. I think they should be more active now. And to be clear, I think the strategy that I see for a democratic transition in Venezuela is a strategy in which we should encourage defections in the regime, the contradictions within the regime. And I think that would put a lot of pressure to Maduro, But I think the only way out in the end is a negotiation. So we need for Maduro to be cornered into accepting a negotiation. And that negotiation will require the support of the US in the form of an off-ramp for Maduro, as you were saying before. They probably fear that if they give up power, they would end in a jail, and they will not do that. They would probably prefer to die fighting than to accept that outcome. So for me, it's about how we generate those contradictions, that internal pressure for them to accept the negotiation in which they would have a deal that would allow them to avoid that scenario.
There was, of course, a Wall Street Journal report over the weekend that said that the U.S. government has in negotiations floated the possibility of some kind of amnesty deal for Maduro. It was interesting to me that the State Department then came out and very vigorously denied that report. So tough to know exactly what's happening. Roberto, my final question for you, I want to bring things back from the international part of this back to the domestic part. I have to confess, and I don't think this is a secret, I think you know this, that I'm quite pessimistic when I look ahead in Venezuela because I see a government that is scared to give up power and just won't consider it. That any kind of negotiation going forward would really just be a smokescreen. That their model going forward is either Nicaragua or Cuba. It seems to me like if Venezuela is to turn out any differently, it will depend on what happens within Venezuela and specifically the ability of Marina Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez and the opposition to keep the Venezuelan population mobilized on the streets and keeping pressure on the regime. I feel almost embarrassed saying it that way because it's very easy for me to sit here in a comfortable office in New York and say that, that people on the ground there need to remain mobilized at a time when doing so, when protesting involves the risk of death, injury, torture, and so on. My question for you is, do you think it will be possible to keep the Venezuelan people mobilized on the streets, focused on all of this, when there have been so many cycles of hope and repression over the last 10 plus years?
Yes, I think it's possible to keep people mobilized in a way, and that's what responsible leadership is about. And I think Maria Corina and Edmundo have practiced responsible leadership so far, which is to mobilize people in a way that reduces the risks of that repression, but keeps the movement alive. I think I agree with you. That's a critical part of the equation. I think it's not enough. I think the international community has to play an important role in making it clear to Maduro, not only by doing public statements, but by taking actions, that the course that they have taken, it's unsustainable. And it's not going to be easy for Maduro to continue having the type of regime that he has had so far.
Are you referring to sanctions? Or are you referring, what?
I am referring to that. I'm referring, of course, also to putting pressure on the people who are repressing the people, the Venezuelan people. That's one very important piece of the equation for me. And also, as I was saying, limiting the capacity of Maduro to keep detaching Venezuela from our region and our natural partners, which is the Western Hemisphere. So I think that should be the priority. And also, I want to be very clear that after what happened on July 28th, I think Maduro is going to have a very, very hard time on consolidating the type of regime that they now represent. And of course, I hear you when you put the example of Nicaragua and Cuba. I think Venezuela is different than those countries. As I was saying before, the Venezuelan crisis is a Latin American crisis. It's no longer a crisis about only a specific country. And also, Venezuela represents, I think, the opportunity for the region and the hemisphere to overcome an authoritarian model that has tried to kidnap society, that it's resisting that for a long time. When you say examples such as Cuba, when you say examples such as Nicaragua, those countries haven't had a July 28th. July 28th, on which the vast majority of Venezuelans expressed their desire for change, taking into account that we have over 8 million people that left the country that would have also voted for the opposition. So it's a consensus in Venezuelan society that we want change. And I think it's going to be very hard for Maduro to maintain his internal cohesion in a model that it's going to lead to nowhere in terms of economic progress, in terms of international recognition, in terms of normalizing the situation of Venezuela. They have to accept a negotiation. And the work of the opposition and civil society in Venezuela is to keep mobilizing for that, to keep putting the incentives on the table, which I think has been very good. Maria Corina, Edmundo, talking about the importance of negotiations as well, of that off-ramp for people in the regime, but also for the international community to keep the attention.
Roberto, wishing you luck and your country luck. Thanks so much for joining us on the AQ Podcast.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.